Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear a little better? Good. The focus of the discussion this afternoon is to clarify a set of assumptions about the nature of human beings. After my last presentation, somebody from the audience came up and said they had a picky little point, which was, don't talk about the nature of man because that's chauvinistic, but to talk about the nature of human beings. Well, I don't think it's a picky point, actually, because it's a main point for this day and age. But if I slip into it, it is because I'm using man in the generic sense of the term. You know, that word actually means human being. And I've often thought, just confidentially, that there's discrimination against men because we only get stuck with a generic term, and we've never been giving a specific term for us only. So you can't interpret it the other way around, you see. Whitehead says that it is the purpose of philosophy to disclose the nature of reality and experience, and to present evidence in support of some basic premises from which logical thought can proceed. If you have no premise, logical thought hasn't got anything to proceed from. And if you cannot spin out logical thought, you will not be able to make sense out of your existence. Not very much sense, anyway. In fact, it's one of the major ways in which we create order about ourselves. Without order, meaning is not possible. Meaning arises out of grasping sense-making relationships among items of experience. And if you want to kind of go around in life wondering what's it all about at every turn, that's what will happen to you if you do not organize either implicitly or explicitly some basic premises from which reasonably logical thought may proceed. That's why without philosophy there isn't any science, because it is the function and purpose of science to order the facts of experience, thereby leading us to understanding and explanation. That's why if we want education ever to be a science, it must have this context of philosophy and theory. I always feel called upon to justify any philosophical and theoretical statement or the need for it. And I think those few comments do just that. Now, I know the problem you'll have if somebody tonight asks you, what's philosophy and why do we need it? You will probably say, well, I know somebody who can tell you, but for the life of me, I can't remember exactly what it is now. But it's in some explanations of these things are in some of the reprints and materials that you have. You won't be able to get it the first time around, and you shouldn't necessarily expect it of yourself. It'll take a little while to get into it. And when you do, though, you will find it to be a door opener onto new horizons. And when you peek onto those new horizons, changes will begin to happen in you. And that's where growth will come from. It's a fundamental premise of philosophical thought, generally, that something cannot come out of nothing. That, in fact, everything emerges out of an antecedent. And we've found by experience that if you want to understand anything, you need to get a fix on what it came out of. It's one thing to just look at it as it is right now before your very eyes, but you may not get a very deep understanding of it by such an examination by itself. You need to see how it got where it was by examining the steps it came through in its recent history, or its ancient history, or whatever. This is particularly true, incidentally, for a child. If you think you can understand that child just by looking at him the way he is right now, you'd be sadly mistaken. You have to know what he came out of. And I'm not talking now just about his family necessarily, though that's probably the most important. But it would be even useful to know, if you could, what his mother ate when she was carrying him or her. Because that's really part of what he came out of. In fact, the meal that you had some hours ago or some days ago is now part of you. And if you had lobster 3 or 4 days ago, that lobster has lost part of his identity and he's joined up with you in a few cells here and there. We are truly connected in a most extraordinary way. My point is, if we are to understand the nature of human beings, then we must know from whence we came. So, as one context for understanding this question about the nature of human beings, we have to understand something of our history. And to understand something of that, we have to understand something of evolution. So I'm going to present a quick overview about evolution as one indispensable context for getting a grip on the nature of humanity, and therefore the nature of those children that we are serving as teachers and practitioners and diagnosticians and parents and whatnot. In the 1950s, researchers at the University of California in Los Angeles made an extraordinary discovery. They discovered several of nature's natural time clocks, which enable us to get a fix on the age of things on this earth. We found out that uranium, which is radioactive, decays at a certain rate. And when it is fully finished decaying, it turns into lead. We know that radiopotassium eventually turns into argon. We know that rubidium-87 eventually turns into strontium-87. And we've been able to compute the rates at which those decaying processes take place, so that any material or substance which contains any of those, like a bone or a skull or a rock that has any of these elements, and there are lots of them, it's a big long list now. Perhaps you're most familiar with carbon-14. The reason I didn't cite carbon-14 is that the half-life of carbon-14 is about 50,000 years, so it's no good for examining the age of anything that's over 50,000 years old. But the half-life of some of these other things is in the billions of years, so that it will measure things that are very, very old. We found out then, through these methods, these natural time clocks of nature, that the oldest rocks on the Earth are around 3 billion years old, and that meteorites that have fallen on the Earth from outside are somewhere between 4 and 5 billion years old. Today, most geophysicists believe, and there seems to be such good solid evidence for it, that the Earth is around 4.5 billion years old. And that our sun, in our solar system, in our galaxy, which is one solar system of one galaxy of billions of galaxies, on and on and on. One isn't quite sure what the end might be, or if there is even an end. Maybe the universe is expanding in all directions simultaneously at the speed of light, 186,000 miles per second. The sun came into being around 5 billion years ago, and has about 6 billion years to go before it dies out. Well, you needn't look quite so alarmed. I was telling it to somebody, I can't remember who it was, and I think they said, well, I think I'll still invest in my house, my property. It reminds me of the story of the lady who attended a lecture on astronomy, and somebody was saying that the sun would die out in 6 billion years, and she had this worried look, and she raised her hand. And she said, excuse me, did you say 5 billion or 6 billion? He said, no, I said 6 billion. She said, phew. Well, you needn't really get so alarmed about it, I guess. But somehow, I find knowing those things places me and my consciousness on a different wavelength concerning my relationship to the rest of the cosmos. Knowledge gives perspective, and out of perspective comes motivation and interest. And without perspective and interest and motivation, there is not much actualization of human potential. And it is the essence behind education. That's why I think it's important for teachers to have it, and that's why in teachers we plan to train in the future for a fully fledged NISA operation would be well grounded in these sciences. This world is so rich and so incredibly fascinating in its endless mysteries that anybody who could even afford to yawn with a moment's boredom is out of touch with the reality of what the whole thing is about. And certainly, curiosity is a very important factor that emerges out of this kind of perspective. It's the intrinsic motivator behind much learning. When it dies, you have a learning disability, I would say, of sorts, on your hand, on the part of the child who has no curiosity about anything. The early atmosphere of the Earth had practically no oxygen in it. And it looks as if what we call life itself came on the scene as early as 4 billion years ago. In a minute, I'm going to tell you how big a billion is, because we found out that most people don't know how big a billion is. They're familiar with the sound of the word, and they know after a billion comes a billion, and after a billion comes a trillion, but how big that really is, it's hard to really grasp. Plant life emerged, and plants give up oxygen, and it was they who created the atmosphere that enabled a new form of life to emerge, animal life, which used a new form of energy, namely oxygen. Now, the reason I mentioned the sun is that plant life was dependent upon the sun to create its existence by converting the energy from the sun to making its own self. It's a process called photosynthesis through a substance called chlorophyll. And all the plants that were made store energy. Those plants took that energy from the sun. A photon would leave the sun 93 million miles away. It would come to the earth. It would be grabbed up by the plant, and a leaf would be made, and in the process of making the leaf would store that energy. Later, animals would come along. They'd eat that leaf, add oxygen to it, release that energy, and you can move around and do things. That's why we can grow in the shade. we're using oxygen. The plant can't grow in the shade. Well, a few tricky ones like mushrooms have found out how to get around it, but by and large, most plant life has got to be in the sun. We've got to have those photons. So just think of it. Every time you eat breakfast, you are eating something that somehow originally came into being because some time ago some photons left the sun and came here, and that energy was bound up in a form that you could unlock through your digestive system. So when the sun dies out, we go to, unless we can migrate to another territory at some point in the future. The phenomenon of light itself is so mind-boggling that there's enough there to keep you inspired daily. That's why most physicists I know have a kind of a secret source of inspiration, those who are really into it, precisely for that reason. And you know, some of the stars are so far away, they're billions of light years away, and a light year is the length, is the distance it takes a particle of light to travel in one whole year at the rate of 186,000 miles per second. So that some of the stars that you see at night, the photon that goes into your retina and causes the chemical reaction on the rhodopsin that sets up an impulse that makes your mind say, I see a star, that light started on its journey several billion years ago and is just now arriving in your eyeball. And that the star that it came from may no longer be there. It could have burned out, and has disappeared, and is no longer there. I think that's thrilling. I hope you do too. Just the idea of it is somehow so extraordinary. Well, there are 92 differentiable natural elements that made up this earth. Only 4 of them are used to make up 99% of the physical structure of our bodies. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And as you can see, hydrogen and oxygen are in there, and that's what water's made out of. And we would be stuck. We never would have come into being without water and some of the extraordinary properties of water, which I wish we could go into. We could have a whole seminar just on the nature of water and ice. Well, I can't resist telling you one. Water is made up of 1 oxygen atom and 2 hydrogen atoms. Now, where do you think the hydrogen atoms are hooked to this oxygen molecule? Just anywhere? No, they have a specific geometry. They're hooked out at an angle of 104 degrees and 31 minutes. Sort of like this. And it is that geometric structure that enables water to hold together when it turns into ice. But when it turns into ice and it hooks together, it expands slightly so that it is lighter than water. If that were not the case, it would not float. And if ice did not float, it is unlikely we would have life. Because as it is now, when the water freezes, it comes to the top, the sun hits it, and it melts. Otherwise, everything would just freeze over, and that'd be it. So just that one factor of the morphology, the geometry of the water molecule and its relationship to a solid state ice played an important part in the evolution of ice. And I have a list of about 2,500 little items like that, all on which our lives depended in the past. So you can see how special we are. We had to wiggle our way through an enormous number of delicate conditions before we could get where we are now. I wish I had time to tell you about the structure of DNA because DNA is the actual protein substance that contains the code that is followed in the emergence of life to create a specific creature. It is so unbelievably and magnificently complex and well ordered. The body is made up of large numbers of different types of proteins. All proteins are differentiated into amino acids. And the sequence of amino acids, the order in which they are placed, creates the type of protein. You can take the same amino acids and shuffle them around, you get a different kind of protein. You put them in this order and this length, you have hair. You put them in this order, you have blood. You put them in this order, you have your nose. You put them in this order, you have the liver. Dozens of kinds, hundreds of kinds of different proteins, all out of 20 amino acids. And all of this is coded by chemicals called nucleic acids. Now we can get an idea of how we're related to each other, all living things, by examining one kind of enzyme which is common to all animals and plants. There's one, well, do you know what an enzyme is? An enzyme is an organic catalyst. You know, when there's a chemical reaction, it can be kind of sluggish. You can speed it up by introducing another element which sort of organizes it and then gets the thing going and then pulls out. And it itself is not changed, but it is facilitated in the process, the chemical reaction.